morning. My name is Dr. Sexton, and I'm the director of a research project called Religious Life for Women in East and Central Africa, a Sustainable Future. We've just finished work on that project and are releasing the report. We'd like to encourage sisters all around the world to download the report, which is available from the UISG website, as we believe it will be of interest to all of you. So now I'm going to run through a few points about the research and share with you some thoughts to encourage you to look at the reports. So first of all, I'm going to explain the goals, the aims of the project and how we went about the research. So the aim of the project was to encourage and further enrich local discussion, theological discussion at local level about the apostolic or active form of religious life for women in East and Central Africa, and specifically in 5 countries: Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Uganda, and Zambia. So we really wanted to hear sisters' own theology about religious life, about their own religious lives as lived in their own context, so not so much globally, but as they were living it themselves. What did they value most, and what is essential and central to their religious lives? We then wanted this to be heard internationally, so to contribute to the growing discourse on religious life for women at an international level. So we wanted to be attentive to those voices, to hear them, but then to amplify them globally. So in approaching this research, we followed a few principles, methodological principles. So firstly, we believe that all sisters participating have a theological voice, whether or not they believe that themselves, and whether or not they value that themselves. So often we found that sisters with no formal theological education believed that they knew no theology, and that was not our approach to the project. We believed that they all had theology to share. Secondly, we felt that those theological voices could best be heard in conversation with each other. And thirdly, we recognised that we are a team of outsiders. We are not religious sisters, and neither are we from the continent of Africa. So the first thing we did was recruit a team of 5 sisters from those 5 countries I mentioned to work with us on the project, and they implemented the project locally. We also then consulted with sisters across the region, with sisters in leadership positions and with those who'd undertaken research previously, and asked them what they thought we ought to be looking at. So we consulted them widely on what should be the topic of the research. So what came out of these consultations with sisters is that they wanted us to ask sisters themselves across these countries what for them is the essence of their understanding of religious life. What is at its heart for them? So what do sisters say is the essence of religious life for them today and in the future in these countries? We decided to gather the information in 2 stages. In stage 1, we asked each sister to tell us the 5 key points in their understanding of the essence of religious life for women as lived in their own context. We received responses from 621 sisters from 79 congregations across the 5 countries. 50 of these congregations then proceeded into stage 2 of the project. And in this stage, they held discussion groups. So 56 discussion groups were held. Some congregations held 2 or more. The data we collected was analysed by the team, and we identified a number of emerging themes from the data. In stage 3 of the project, we brought together a group of sisters from the region and former missionaries from the region, and asked them to help us with commentating, identifying and commentating on the theology emerging from the data we collected. We then shared our initial analysis with sisters who participated in the project by running 5 workshops, 1 in each country, and inviting sisters who participated to hear our initial thoughts and then to enter into conversation with us about that. So when the report was produced, the report that has been produced, has been seen and discussed with sisters who took part in the project. So the second point I wanted to share with you, and question to think about, is images of religious life which have come to us from that area itself. So the first image I suppose I have as a result of the research is of a joyful voice. So sisters take great joy in singing and praising and worshipping together. And there's a lot of laughter when you're with sisters in these countries. They enjoy being together and find a lot of joy in their life and in their vocation. Along with that, I would recall an image of tireless commitment to their apostolates and to those in need. but having to balance this commitment with scarce resources available to them. So attempting to address great needs with few resources available to them. The congregations participating in the research were a mixture, approximately 50-50, of both international congregations, or those of pontifical right, and diocesan or indigenous congregations. We found that many of them, in fact most of them, encountered difficulties with financial sustainability in the short, medium and long term. And this, whether they are pontifical, of pontifical right, or whether they're diocesan and indigenous congregations, most are facing severe financial constraints. So you may be interested to know whether we found differences between the 5 countries. Actually, what we found was a remarkable level of coherence and similarity in findings across the 5 countries. And that's one of the things that sisters seem to most welcome in our feedback meetings. So in stage 1 of the research, when we asked sisters to give us those 5 examples of the essence of religious life, we found that the themes of apostolate and community life occurred most frequently, along with prayer, and this profile was similar across the 5 countries. So we found the same elements are valued: prayer life and the following of Christ, community life and togetherness, and the role of religious as bearing witness to the word of Christ, to the gospel. That's very important, and of evangelization. So beforehand, people told us that maybe sisters in Kenya may only want to know about religious life in Kenya, or similarly those in Uganda may only be interested in findings about religious life in Uganda. But that was not our experience. In fact, sisters seem to take great comfort and consolation from the fact that they are all experiencing similar difficulties and challenges, but also a great sense of solidarity and oneness, of communion, in sharing the same vocation in the church, and in sharing the same love for and joy in their vocation. So some differences are probably more between the different kinds of congregations than between countries, although there are obvious differences in circumstances and context in countries. So Kenya, for example, would have a stronger infrastructure than Malawi or Tanzania. And we found sisters in Tanzania very much more concerned about their levels of education and the impact on the evangelization, their ability to carry out evangelization, but also concerned about the impact of poverty on their lives and on the lives of those around them, and again on their efforts of evangelization. We also found in Tanzania concern for the impact of globalization on young people, on those entering religious life, and on religious life and its values, religious life itself and its values. So maybe one difference as well is that in some countries there is now anecdotal, if not factual, statistical evidence that fewer women are entering religious life. So we're beginning to see some changes in the numbers of women coming to religious life. We certainly heard that in Zambia and in Kenya. But in Tanzania, there still appear to be large numbers of women entering religious life. So, thinking about religious life globally, and what do we have to learn from this project, which took place in East and Central Africa? What is this telling religious life in other parts of the world? So, I have several points. The first I would say is that religious life is neither uniform nor static. It is international. In fact, it's transnational. It crosses boundaries, and there is a common calling. However, it is dynamic, and it seems to have to grow to adapt to its own context. It needs to be for each particular context and in response to that particular context, as in teachings of the readings of the Sign of the Times. So, for example, in the UK and the West, or the global North, there have been many experiments in and changes in the way community life is lived, and often now is lived in very small groups, or even many sisters live singly. But in the countries we researched in East Africa, community life is absolutely central to religious life there. And this is quite a formal, common form of religious life, of community life. We're doing things together and sharing all aspects of life. Worship, income generation, eating, relaxation are done together. And this is highly valued, particularly shared worship at set times during the day often. It's hard to see at this point in time whether this is something that has been inherited from the form of religious life which arrived in many of those countries now more than 100 years ago, or has been part of the development of newer congregations, or whether indeed this is a form of living that is most suited to these particular socio-cultural contexts and to the situation of women in those contexts, where women living by themselves might be found to be very challenging. But we found that religious life ought to be able to develop as it needs to for that particular context, in response, as I say, to reading the sign of the times and discernment, and in line with the charism and mission of each congregation. So another point I would make is not to take growth and continuing large numbers for granted, and I'm sure many sisters have learnt that already, nor to see them as the main sign of vitality. Younger members and newer members do not necessarily equate vitality of congregations. As I said, there are indications that some congregations are already seeing the numbers of new entrants fall. So to be alert to where this is happening and listen. This trend may not be a trend, and it may not go in the same direction as in the global north. But there are lessons to be learned perhaps from the global north. But at the same time, whatever is happening must be listened to and seen and in its own way, and find its own way into the future. We cannot assume that it will follow the same trajectory as in other situations, nor that the response needs to be the same. Finally, technology. WhatsApp was a real friend to the project. We collected much of our data through WhatsApp. And indeed, WhatsApp and other forms of social media, Facebook, Instagram, all offer great opportunities for communication, as many congregations are finding, particularly in these contexts. However, we did see the importance of learning discipline in the use of social media. We heard great concern from sisters at the impact of social media on community life and on sisters' ability to be available to each other and to be available to those to whom they serve. So finally, there are 3 issues I would like to highlight from the report. The first of these is sisters in the role of the church. So sisters and their role in the church is a question we identified was raised by sisters right at the very beginning of the project in our consultation meetings. And we asked whether sisters always need to be, or are they always indeed the other in the parish context? Can they receive as well as give to others in this context? Or do power dynamics and conflict within church communities inhibit this experience and understanding of the church as communion? So we found quite a lot of contradiction in this area. Firstly, we would say that sisters are very clear that theirs is an ecclesial vocation. We asked sisters where they belong in the church, and their answer was a resounding everywhere, at the heart of the church, and they feel they belong everywhere. But they see themselves often as being alongside ordinary people, at the grassroots. They see they have a different role from priests. Often they say priests preach, and we put into practice with the people. They accompany the people. And many say they feel loved and appreciated for the ministries that they offer to people. However, at the same time, we heard many comments and expressions of concern about the lack of understanding of religious life in the church. Either people not knowing how or where sisters fit in the church, so they are not ordinary parishioners, and yet neither are they priests, or elevating sisters to a very special status, a separate status, very much a set apart and even a set above. So seeing sisters as special beings and having high expectations of them. So these concerns also extend to sisters' relationships with clergy, with priests and bishops. Although we hear comments about positive experiences of collaboration with clergy, an appreciation of sisters and invitations for sisters to be involved in parish life, we heard many, many more comments of sisters feeling misunderstood, undervalued by clergy, of even being exploited and excluded from parish life, being made to feel they do not belong, of stories of competition with sisters and even jealousy for fear that sisters are more popular with parishioners, and of many disputes over ownership of land and institutions. So sisters feeling powerless, sometimes used, and excluded from church. So we felt that these experiences seem to make sisters feel other quite often, that they don't belong. It was very rare for us to hear sisters say of themselves, "We are church," and express a strong sense of communion. And this in stark contrast to how they seem to experience communion in community, despite difficulties experienced in community life. So the second issue I'd like to talk about is sustainability. If we think about it in terms of the image offered to us in the document, New Wines and New Wineskins, we found initially that a big issue for sisters in our consultation period was the wineskins. So it concerns largely about sustainability of new membership and financial self-reliance. However, for us, we heard in the project, over the course of the project, we heard sisters more concerned about the condition of the wine itself and about the question of renewal, the need for new wine. So sisters openly questioning and discerning how they are living their religious lives, the quality and depth of spiritual life, and whether the following of Christ according to the individual charisms is truly at the heart of their religious life. In response to these voices, we feel the bigger challenge of sustainability is how the life, therefore, is being lived in its spiritual and charismatic aspects of the congregations. Specifically in two issues, the understanding of charism and the balance of community and apostolates. So charism is really a very complex issue for many, and we found many sisters with an apparently strong understanding of the complexity and complex various facets of charism, but we also saw much confusion between charism and the apostolates and apostolic activities of the congregation. And sometimes also we found perhaps an over-reliance on a simplified statement about the charism, reducing it to a strapline such as helping the poor. So just some final comments about poverty in the surrounding environment and sisters' interaction with that. The topic of apostolates and ministries was a very significant theme in the results, but still came behind the number of mentions and discussions of community life. The responding to the needs of those living in poverty or experiencing both material and spiritual poverty is clearly one of the ways, or the way, in which sisters understand themselves to be following Christ, and indeed to even be in Christ's presence among those and for those they serve. There's great commitment among sisters to Pope Francis's teachings on encounter, and there's concern for new forms of poverty, especially amongst women and children, and instances of sex trafficking, working with refugees, migrants, victims of child sexual abuse, and concern at discerning how best to respond. So some of the challenges we saw among sisters in terms of how they respond. We found sisters struggling to balance the desire for togetherness in community life, worshipping, eating and recreating together. So really a semi-conventional model of religious life. So balancing this with very demanding apostolates, where often sisters are working night shifts, away from community for long periods of time, unable to attend set community prayer held at set times. And we felt maybe the model needs to be more flexible so that sisters can respond to the demands of ministries without feeling they're missing their own set prayer time, and with perhaps a new approach to prayer, so an understanding of the role of prayer being integrated into apostolic activities. Secondly, again related to charism, how to respond to new emerging needs of poverty, new forms of poverty, according to the charism of the congregation, rather than all congregations trying to address a very wide range of needs and sisters stretching themselves very thinly, and seeing their charism as the apostolic activity itself. Thirdly, again, the issue of lack of financial resources to alleviate poverty. This seems to cause sisters great pain and frustration. They recognise that no matter what financial problems they may face as a congregation, in relation to the poor around them, they are absolutely better off. But they still struggle to meet their own financial needs and those around them. So we found sisters often talking about their ministries in terms of charity rather than development, and a lot of one-way serving of people, and less receiving from those whom they serve, or admitting that this could be acceptable for sisters also to receive. When sisters speak of empowerment, often they simply mean support, rather than tackling the underpinning causes of injustice and taking part in advocacy. So rather than tackling the causes of inequality and injustice, we found that apostolates and ministries are very rarely framed in terms of Catholic social teaching and thought as a basis for those ministries. or in the language of preferential option for the poor, even though it is clear that is what many are doing, making that preferential option. And perhaps more interestingly, we found very, very little mention of Laudato Si, only 3 times in the whole project. So finally, we just say the last challenge is really for sisters to think about how they respond to many of these emerging forms of new poverty and the skills, education and knowledge that they need. We found a lot of concern among sisters for education and training in order to meet some of these new forms of poverty. So thank you very much for listening, and I would really encourage you to download the summary of the report. UISG will be providing the link where you can download the summary and the report. So thank you very much.